Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Laverton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm so happy and honored today to welcome Molly Worthen as our guest on Conversing. Molly is a scholar of American history. She serves as the Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is a freelance journalist. She teaches particularly on issues of North American religion and politics, global Christianity, and the history of ideas. She has written not only a number of significant books, which include Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism, and another book entitled The Man on Whom Nothing Was Lost, The Grand Strategy of Charles Hill. Her most recent book, about to come out on May 27th, is a book entitled Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. Molly, we're so delighted to welcome you today to Conversing.
Thanks for having me.
You know, I've followed your writing in the past, and I was therefore particularly excited to be able to have a chance to read your most recent book, which is just about to come out, called Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. It's a title and a subtitle that I think, for me at least, captures part of the mystery and wonder, amazement, befuddlement that so many kind of charismatic, a word that we will explore, charismatic experiences have occurred over the course of American history and now, as you say, are present with us in the figure of Donald Trump and his surrounding religious constituents in particular. So how did it happen that you came to this particular topic as an American history professional and scholar? What was it that came together that caused you to want to write on this subject?
I guess if I look at all my work over the course of my career to this point, one through line is the question of authority and how people decide who to listen to, essentially, as they carve their path through life. And so in some sense, there's continuity between this project and my other books and articles. I also view every book as mainly a vehicle for learning stuff.
Yes.
And so I was looking my last book was focused on some of the kind of internal battles within American evangelicalism since World War II. And so I was looking to build on that, but take a broader scope and engage with American history in the longue durée.
Yes.
And then lastly, it has seemed to me over the past generation or so that those of us who are scholars of religion, we have to come to terms with the fact that many of the tools we have long used to track the religious impulse in Western people, things like church attendance figures, membership, what people tell the pollster when they call up and say, do you believe in God? How often do you pray? Statements by religious elites. All of these typical metrics that are really the traditional way of getting the pulse of this part of human life, they don't work so well anymore, right? I mean, we see in every new wave of poll data the climbing number of people who don't affiliate with any religious tradition. I think that it would be a mistake to interpret that data to mean that the religious impulse is evaporating. I think it is hardwired into who we are as humans. The question is where to look for it now that it is no longer landing with so much regularity in organized religion. And so I suspected that maybe our relationships with charismatic leaders might be one place to look.
Yes, right. So define for us this word that is so central to the book itself, charisma. What does the word mean and how do you understand it in relationship to the research that you've done?
Yeah, this is so important because part of why charisma is interesting is because it is this squishy term that I think we toss around without really reflecting carefully on what it means. I use it to mean, well, I guess in the most straightforward sense, the allure in a leader that gives him or her the power to move a crowd, that is premised on a relationship. So you need two parties at least to have charisma. It's not solely a quality and efflorescence that shines out from the individual without other people to interact with it. It is distinct from charm, from celebrity. These are qualities that can be closely allied to charisma, but they're not the same thing. I think the heart of charisma, and this is the conclusion I came to toward the end of my research as I was trying to sort of pull it together, is the leader's ability to tell a story, to invite potential followers into a story that somehow does a better job at explaining the chaos and the suffering, lending meaning, granting a role that involves some sense of agency to these followers compared to other stories that are on offer in the culture. So to me, that's really the heart of it. And I was surprised to find myself writing about all kinds of people who were not necessarily great public speakers, not particularly good looking, no amazing sex appeal, like all of these things that I was expecting, I did not see as kind of guaranteed markers, but rather it's that sort of transcendent storytelling ability that is the heart of charisma.
It's a wonderful distinction, and I think really does bring into focus the narrative that you're telling over the arc of the book. I do want to say for listeners that it's a comprehensive look from pre-revolutionary to today, American history, and various figures and movements and revivals and all kinds of things that have occurred over the course of that time. And what I think is so fascinating about what you're doing is, in part, it has this absolutely transcendental quality to it, a word that itself is important to the argument that you're making. And yet it also lands with and I like your use of the word agency in this context, that there's a transcendental quality that also brings human agency and a horizon of hope, which seems to be one of the alluring factors involved consistently in charisma, is that whatever the vision of that spokesperson may be, there's a sense that there's an agency that's possible, and it leads to a better life in some particular kinds of ways based on the way that at least you're describing it. Do you think that captures the dynamic that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there is this paradoxical quality to it because I think as humans, we tend to seek some framework in which, as you say, we feel that our decisions make some difference to our ultimate fate. But we also want the comfort of knowing that some being or force larger than us is ultimately in charge and is going to make it all okay. I think we seek both of those things, even though that's a bit of a paradox.
Yes. So there is this quality that comes through to me in the book of charismatic leaders who are first literally being seen in some sort of way. They capture through their work and their proclamation or their activities, they give demonstration of something that is there to be seen, and they themselves are being seen. And at the same time, the impact of the messaging so often is that the audience is really seen by them and by the transcendent vision that they're communicating. So both are really in the picture. It's not just about looking at the one who is the special anointed one, but it's that somehow through that person, I too, or we too, see ourselves more clearly than we would if we didn't have the intervention of this transcendental quality. Is that reading your evidence?
That's interesting. I think that's right. I think there is this, and while it is not always a literal interpersonal seeing, sometimes it is mediated in various ways over distance through communications technology. There is this sense in which the follower recognizes his or her identity, his or her needs and desires in this story, in this picture of the world offered by the leader.
Right. Yeah. I remember way back in college taking a Religion 1 class in which the discussion of special revelation brought out the frequently made point, and that is that special revelation can't be examined because of the nature of its specialness, right? That the quality of its being outside any other mediated form means that the person can just say, I believe and I have seen and I have experienced God in these particular ways. And I wonder if there is for you in particular, as a historian who's absolutely an investigative historian looking at examining the nature of the evidences of what was happening, if there was a tension between trying to examine the unexaminable. Was that a tension for you as you were researching this?
Well, do you mean in the sense that part of what one is trying to capture in asking the question, is a leader charismatic? What is happening in this relationship between leaders and followers? It seems to necessitate some effort to recapture this ineffable dynamic of what Anne Hutchinson or Andrew Jackson or Joseph Smith or any of these people were like in person. Is that what you mean?
Yes, I think that's right. And there's a curtain behind which you can't go, a little bit like Oz.
That's right. That's right. I was very hung up on that initially. And I think it's a reason why those historians who have focused on charisma have generally stopped short of pushing their story back much beyond the advent of mass media. I think there's this sense that it is a modern mass media phenomenon, and also that you need that extra layer of primary source material that you get in the age of the radio and, of course, later on video and the internet. However, to me, that cut short so many interesting questions about continuity, about kind of how America as a really quite a Protestant, individualistic culture has interacted with authority. And then I suppose I reflected on the fracturing and the bafflement in our own 21st century political culture and the way in which I think so many of us, regardless of what your politics are, you've probably had the experience in the past few years of looking at some public figure, some political figure and his or her interactions with followers and scratching your head and thinking that individual is either just totally without appeal or perhaps actually aggressively revolting. How can so many people like that person? And so if I experience that same sense of disconnection and bafflement when I have all the access I want to all the primary source material I could wish for, then it's perhaps kind of unavoidable. It's an unavoidable dilemma that is not solved. We kid ourselves if we think that we solve it through simply more sources. But that said, whenever you're investigating a historical question, one of the first things you have to come to terms with are the limits of your source base, right?
Yes, right.
And you're not able to perfectly recapture reality. Reality is this asymptote that we can never perfectly reach, but we can creep a little bit closer to it by being creative in how we piece together clues about what it was like to meet Joseph Smith or interact with his ideas or sit in the audience in New York City and hear a spiritualist trance speaker, this sort of thing. And the best we can do is kind of be suggestive and hope that we say something that gets us a little bit closer to historical reality.
Yes. Well, I think the way you do it from a reader's point of view for me was captivating and took me into an understanding of some figures that I knew not nearly as well as I now know them because of your writing, but also down routes of investigation about them and about their appearance, as you suggested a minute ago, or their qualities that may or may not even have, by today's standards, wouldn't fit any kind of classic assumptions about somebody that we would designate as, quote, charismatic, but who, for other reasons, mostly about what they were saying, how they were, the authority, to go back to that word again, the authority with which they do or say or offer what they believe they've been given to transmit, was just really down a much more complicated and thicker road than I knew, and in certain cases in particular. I think especially of Joseph Smith, but a number of other people, Andrew Jackson as well. So I guess tell us a little bit, just as a way of whetting the appetite for our listeners, what were one or two of the people that for you were the greatest discoveries along this way that stood out to you as particularly fascinating examples of what you were investigating?
I suppose I had some personal discoveries, both in connection to figures who seemed obvious to me that, they were kind of mandatory for me to include, and then also much more obscure figures. Joseph Smith was a subject who I thought I knew fairly well, and he is, I think, held up as someone who was, obviously interpersonally very compelling. And there are some somewhat famous primary sources that get quoted again and again about how he was so tall and had these arresting blue eyes, and, to shake his hand would just fill you with a sense of the Holy Spirit, right? And so I guess I expected the story of his appeal to be a straightforward one, and one that really hinged on interpersonal dynamics. But the more I considered the development of the early Mormon church and reflected on just how many early converts joined the church, relocated their entire lives in many cases to wherever the Mormons were located at the time, without ever setting eyes on Joseph Smith. When I considered the several thousand new converts who heard the Mormon message or read the Book of Mormon in Britain or in Canada and shut down their lives there and moved to Nauvoo sight unseen, I had to reconsider the locus of the charisma. And my work on him was one sort of turning point where I had to really rethink the relationship of the individual and to the what's actually going on, and came to put more emphasis on the story. I'll say another surprise for me was when I was researching John F. Kennedy. So again, probably the one figure in American history people most frequently associate with the word charisma is JFK, right? Camelot, great hair, tan,
Yes, right.
just the kind of icon of 1960s glamour. And so I get into sort of piecing together his career, his message, what is it about the particular context of the early 1960s that framed his appeal? And I found myself paying more and more attention to Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois, the unsuccessful, twice nominated Democratic candidate for president who ran against Eisenhower in 52 and 56, and is remembered, if he's remembered at all, as, a nerdy, cerebral, kind of avuncular, right? Totally not the first poster boy of charisma that comes to mind.
Right.
And yet the more I remember a real turning point when I came across Norman Mailer's long account, I want to say in Esquire, of the 1960 Democratic Convention, which Stevenson almost stole from Kennedy. At least it looked that way in the early days of the convention. And Mailer's account of just the stamping and cheering for Stevenson and the swarms of young people ranging from, sort of very square-looking suburban young families to kind of beatnik types, all just swelling with this spontaneous energy for this candidate. When I then got into, some of the journalists' reflections on Adlai Stevenson as a speaker, I had to reckon with the gap between how he's remembered in our own time and perhaps his real magnetism then, and also his influence on how Kennedy ultimately shaped his campaign, and the way in which I think Kennedy, watching Stevenson, learned, number one, about the advantages of proximity to expertise and intellectual credibility at that particular moment in American history. And so much of my book is really about the fortunes of established institutions in American culture, because charismatic figures always define themselves vis-a-vis institutions. And the 50s and 60s are really this anomalous period in American history where Americans have this high regard for traditional institutions that they never had before and they have not ever had since. But I think Kennedy perceived correctly that Stevenson took the kind of egghead identity a bit too far. He was too professorial. And so Kennedy very expertly crafted this sort of hybrid identity where he was a war hero and, this sort of glamorous figure while also having a brain trust and being able to call on the Harvard professors. And this became a pattern that I perceived again and again in American history, where I saw that the figures that were the most successful, if we measure success in terms of their ability to do what Max Weber would have called routinizing their charisma in some way, making sure that their message, what they stood for, did not simply evaporate at the end of their own careers. We find figures who were not perfectly in line with the charismatic appetites of their age, but rather strategically borrowed from different charismatic playbooks to respond to the anxieties of the time without perhaps going too far. And I think Kennedy is an example of that. So those are a couple of the ones that I didn't think would surprise me and did. And I went down many other rabbit trails also, but those two stand out.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you're suggesting just there in the final part of that comment that there was a measure of self-restraint that was expressed by people with charisma in the cases that you just pointed to, that they had a capacity to both exercise it and routinize it, but in doing so to also control it so that it wasn't overdone. Is that what you were saying?
That's interesting. Well, I suppose there are a couple of questions maybe embedded in what you're saying. I mean, you are raising one of the perennial questions that historians always struggle with, which is the gap or the consistency between what our subjects are thinking and intending consciously and what they actually do, right? So how kind of deliberately strategic was someone like Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr. or Joseph Smith for that matter, or I got very interested in some of the leaders of new religious movements in the 1970s, particularly a 13-year-old Indian boy named the Guru Maharaji, who developed this brief but quite significant following among thousands of primarily younger sort of former activist Americans in the early 1970s. And, there we're talking about essentially a kid, literally a kid. How do we think about intention and planning? I suppose it's not a question one can answer with a broad brush stroke.
Right.
I think there certainly are leaders who are far more deliberate. Although even when I say that, and I would say that of someone like JFK, I'm answering partly out of my own instinct. It's so rare that we get lucky with the sources and someone leaves us a diary in which they confess their every thought. And then, of course, we have to ask questions of the diary, right? And what they were really intending. So it's a question one can acknowledge, but never perhaps answer satisfactorily.
Right. So part of what you're getting at there, it seems to me, is really the issue of intuition and how much charismatic leaders function out of intuition rather than out of analysis. And therefore, intentionality becomes less about necessarily a cognitive reasoned process of management and more about an instinct of intuition about how to operate in a way that will serve the best interests of the thing that they're doing or of themselves.
Absolutely. And I think in so many cases that I found myself arrested by, these are individuals who, well, they're steeped in their particular cultural milieu, and then they also are operating out of their own personal life experiences.
Right.
I mean, one point that is, very mundane and yet profound, and I'm constantly trying to drive home to my students, is that in our comfortable 21st century Western existence with access to modern medicine, we have no concept of the constant threat of extreme illness, accident, and death that hung over the heads of most humans for most of the history of our species.
Right.
And I was really struck in writing this book by how many of the figures in the part of the book that really carries us up to the post-World War II period, how many of them had some very significant personal trauma. Whether it's the Puritan heretic Anne Hutchinson, who herself lost a number of children in childbirth and infancy, and also was a kind of part-time midwife who specialized in helping other families make sense of incredible pain and suffering. Joseph Smith, too, had plenty of death and sadness in his personal life. Many of the later women evangelists were quite self-consciously reckoning with the deaths of their children or their mothers, this sort of thing, in framing the mission that they believed God had for them. And I think it is at the intersection of these charismatic leaders' personal experiences and the kind of library of meaning and stories that their culture offers that they often found some innovation to be necessary, some way in which the existing plot lines were not working, perhaps not for them and not for some potential constituency. And I think you're right. That's very rarely a matter of sort of cold calculation, in an office and then going out and focus group testing these different messages, right? Maybe that's a little truer even later. But I think even in modern politics, I think the way humans are, very, very few humans are out and out cynics, totally conscious of a gap between their real perception of reality and the story they're telling. As humans, I think we're wired to believe our own propaganda, to constantly believe the stories we're telling ourselves, and then that informs the story we tell the world.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. A lot of it seems to me, has to do with how people have come to try to find means of managing fear and vulnerability, danger, pain, and other things. And almost always there's a sense that the charismatic leader is somebody who, this is what I think I meant earlier about being seen, about being able to come close to them in their vulnerability in such a way that what they are saying, who they're being, what they're proclaiming, enacting, whatever it might be, how they're demonstrating the power that they are affirming God has given them, is about intersecting with us in our rawness, in our most vulnerable places. And that seems to be, when I stand back and read the book overall and talk not just about the influence of any one person, but really about what the title or subtitle suggests about how charisma has shaped American history. It feels like one way that I would say it has shaped history is by becoming a vortex, of an attractive vortex of an evidence of something transcendental that in some way offers a vigorous living proximity to what is far greater than being merely and typically human. Would you think that's a fair assumption or a fair analysis or reception of what it is that you've provided in the book?
I like that a lot. I think that you're articulating what I mean when I say the religious impulse is finding a place to land other than organized religion, and that part of what it means to feel a true connection with a transcendent source of meaning greater than ourselves is to feel acknowledged and sort of pulled into that as a whole person in a way that is perhaps different from how we reside in other spheres of our social interaction. That is somehow a space in which we can be more fully ourselves. And I think in later American history, certainly in the post-war period, this gets tied up in the massive cultural influence of humanist psychology and positive thinking and the kind of radical individualistic vision of really our power to perfect and save ourselves that I think becomes such a major theme of the 1960s and beyond. And it's a lie. We can't save ourselves. But I think that cultural message, which has always been a thread in American culture going way back, it gets kind of supercharged into a sort of orthodoxy and really a cult of authenticity that I do think makes Americans in that later period perhaps especially vulnerable to the influence of individual charismatic leaders in the period I call the age of the gurus, when, crucially, established institutions, both religious and other kinds of institutions, are approaching really the nadir of their strength, as communities and organizations able to command loyalty.
Right. So as the subtitle of the book promises, you end the book by bringing it to the moment that we're all living in right now and the charisma related to Donald Trump. Tell us about how you see that story intersecting with this longer narrative that you've been telling.
I'll preface this by saying, I think that like any political movement, voters have all kinds of reasons for supporting Trump, like they do any candidate. So I don't mean to offer a kind of monolithic account of every person who has cast a vote for Trump. But I do think that crucial to understanding his appeal is to see the fullness of the story that he has offered voters, that really, I think in many ways, he began building long before he formally entered politics. You can go back and read his interviews with journalists, his appearances on the Oprah Winfrey Show and this kind of thing, and find him not only crafting this narrative about himself, which has been so important as a self-made businessman, really kind of leaving aside the wealth he inherited from his father, who has constantly, fought off evildoers trying to screw him over in various ways, but someone who perceives, and here he is presenting the kind of hidden reality that I think is so crucial to charismatic leaders' appeal, the sense that he's kind of pulling the veil back on a true picture of the world that has been concealed from you up until this point. He perceives that the system is rigged, that, not only he, but, all Americans, all sort of virtuous Americans are ground down by this system that is not worth abiding by because it's fundamentally unfair. And I think as a politician, this narrative has become a story about America being screwed over and denied its proper respect, its proper material wealth, both at the level of kind of the nation as well as individuals. And this is something that, because of the alignment he's proposing between his personal story and the story of the country, he is uniquely positioned to solve. And I think also there are features of him and his communication style that people who don't like Donald Trump find so off-putting and baffling. So, for example, his kind of rambling stream of consciousness speaking style that actually is core to his appeal, I think, for many Trump supporters, because it comes across as a kind of authenticity, as a willingness to tell it how it is and speak off the top of his head. And authenticity as a personal style has no necessary relationship with honesty in terms of correspondence to, empirically verifiable facts, especially because Trump's whole career is only really become possible in this media moment we're in that has this important history through the 80s and the 1990s, and the real kind of bifurcation and fracturing of our media along partisan lines that
Right.
I think got supercharged by the advent of the internet and social media, but is not a product of that. It really predates that. And then I guess I'll say last that while Donald Trump is no one's idea of an Orthodox Christian, he grew up in Norman Vincent Peale's church in New York City, Marble Collegiate Church, hearing the prosperity gospel, the gospel of positive thinking. Norman Vincent Peale's famous book, The Power of Positive Thinking, is still in print,
Right.
sold millions of copies.
Right.
And I think Trump has a really acute spiritual instinct for that picture of reality, one in which we can really reshape reality with our minds. And then he also had a political instinct for a really productive politically alliance with a particular subculture of American Protestantism, and that is the network of independent, charismatic pastors and evangelists and activists who, until recently, I think, were kind of felt themselves to be on the margins of American evangelicalism, but account increasingly for a very large proportion of American Protestantism and global Protestantism. And I think
Yes.
that world of charismatic churches and church networks, apostolic networks, they're often called, it's incredibly complicated. And I very much push back against some of the, I think, rather hysterical media coverage that treats that world as this monolith of, Christian nationalist soldiers marching in lockstep behind Donald Trump. I actually think there's a huge amount of complexity. They're very globally minded in a way that is kind of at odds with the conventional understanding of Christian nationalism. However, that network, parts of it have been really important to really, especially the early momentum of Trump's career, at a time when more mainstream evangelicals were kind of skeptical of him. And he sensed that. He sensed the intersection of his charisma and this particular expression of New Testament charisma in the sense of the Holy Spirit's manifestation, in human communities.
Molly, as I was reading the book and finding it so captivating, challenging, reorienting in various ways, one of the things that was playing out in my mind was a more personal question. And that is that in recent years, it's become known that you've become a Christian, that your conversion is something you've talked about quite publicly and explicitly. And as I was reading that, as I was reading the book, I was aware of thinking, now, how did all of Molly's own spiritual journey intersect with the journey of writing this book? And how did the two things interact in similarity and in distinction? Let's just start with an open question like that one, and then I have a couple follow-ups I'd like to ask.
Yeah, I suppose I was about 2/3 of the way through the rough draft of this book when I was rudely interrupted by the Holy Spirit. I have always studied Christianity as a very sympathetic and frankly envious outsider, and never was entirely happy with my agnostic fence sitting, but also wasn't actively looking to resolve my metaphysical questions when I was evangelized by a pastor I was writing about. And listeners who want the full story can Google me and find one of the interviews I did. I suppose on one hand, I have been reflecting on the consistency between my presuppositions and methods prior to conversion and since. And I think that speaks to perhaps the way in which I was, I think like many modern secular people, borrowing to some degree, at least theistic, if not Christian, presuppositions a lot of the time. But also, if I've always had this conviction that humans are fundamentally religious creatures and they have this impulse to connect to a transcendent source of meaning, to worship, while of course, I have this obligation as a professional historian to maintain some sort of distance from my subject. On the other hand, why should I think that I'm really any different? And so I guess I came to realize that I was writing a book that was fundamentally about spiritual hunger and how humans cope with it, but that I myself had that hunger as well. But I'm not immune to that feature of the human dilemma.
Right. Well, I do think one of the things that is so powerful about the book is that it really does dwell again and again in various ways in different chapters of American history on the very question you just named, which is really, what do we do with our hungers and thirsts that are for a transcendental reality, a metaphysical reality of some kind? Where do they drive us? Where do they leave us? Where do they lead us? And I think the story of your own conversion, which, by the way that I've understood it through watching the very videos that you described, would be analytical and rational and investigative, was in some measure to me consistent with certainly the way that you went about writing this book, but also different than the experiences that you were actually talking about, which were, again, much more beyond reason and beyond analysis and et cetera. And I wondered if that felt like a tension, or whether, in fact, it changed the way that you saw the role of experience in your own conversion, because it certainly sounds as though it was a conversion that in part was analytical in the way I've described, but also was in the end very emotionally and personally profound. It was an encounter. It wasn't just an analysis.
That's really interesting. You're making me think about some echoes between my research and my own experience that I hadn't reflected on. It is certainly true that my own conversion process was the nerdiest conversion you could imagine. I mean, it was a period of a few months during which I did very little other than reading giant tomes of New Testament criticism and, spending hours on, the academic journal database, reading clashing accounts of the evidence for and against the resurrection and the historicity of the different gospels and so forth. And so I very much experienced it as a meticulous process of investigation involving reading so many footnotes. I prayed frequently for a, if not a full-blown mystical experience, then at least like a warm and fuzzy, whatever John Wesley had, right?
Yes.
At
the
Moravian meeting.
Warmed. Yes,
yeah.
right.
Where his heart was strangely warmed, like some little version of that. Didn't happen. Fine. Got to the point where it just seemed like the intellectually honest thing to do when you are more than 51% convinced that the resurrection is the best account of the evidence at hand is to submit to Jesus. So I did. But then in the time following that, I, in my zeal, compelled a few people close to me who are not Christian to engage with some of the books that I had read. And they did not have the same reaction to it that I had to that kind of intellectual case. And that forced me to reckon with the fact that although I perceived my own process as very cold and rational, in fact, the reason I was open to this evidence and these arguments in the way that I was because God had already done something to my desires, that I was walking in the direction of Jesus already. And when I think about some of the communities and movements that I wrote about in my book, I think about the kind of mid-19th century period when I was writing about the Mormons and the spiritualists, and this culture of what struck me as sort of a blend of credulity and skepticism. On the one hand, people opened all kinds of crazy claims that might strike the average modern secular reader as totally fanciful. But on the other hand, audiences turning up to watch the traveling, mesmerist scientific demonstrator, or hear, a spiritualist trance speaker, or, listen to the claims of these Mormon missionaries. You read newspaper accounts or firsthand letters of these episodes, and you see people who are really concerned not to be humbugged. They're very focused on the evidence, the warrant for belief. They think of themselves, and indeed, this is the language, right? This is the language that Mormons use to this day. This is the language that spiritualists used in their heyday. They talk about someone who is exploring their worldview as an investigator, and that's very much the mindset. And I think that's part of what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation when we were talking about the desire for that sense of agency, that desire to have this sense that I am really weighing my existential options and I am deciding whether or not to step. And maybe this is a testament to the kind of fundamental Protestant DNA of our culture, that whatever your worldview, if you're, a product of American culture, you probably have this sense of this sort of Protestant sense of consciousness and your own independent will and agency. And I saw that in my subjects, and I now see the complexity of it in my own life too.
So Molly, one of the things that has occurred to me as I was reading the book and experiencing the book and experiencing you, though we hadn't met until today, experiencing you through the times of listening to videos of you telling your conversion story and other lectures that you've given, I came to think of you as, in the spirit of your book, a charismatic academic. And by that, I mean holding these two things together that you've just been describing. On the one hand, the academic, investigative mind and heart, the posture of analysis, critique, evaluation, assessment, tied up also, however, with a warm personality, an interpersonal connectedness about how you, I think, present yourself in the world, and that you tell the story of your own conversion and of this book in a way that invites us into your experience as a charismatic academic who is, in a certain way, an embodiment of the very things that you're talking about as a trend in American religion around charisma, but now embodied in particular in your own story. I wonder if you would just respond to that.
I'm flattered and maybe unnerved by your observation. And I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, not having thought about this. I think to think about it a lot more. But I suppose, well, I wonder if I think you're giving me credit for a level of profundity that I don't have. But maybe when I think about my instincts as a student of history and religion, I do have an instinct to take the broadest frame I think I can manage and to try to connect the discrete topics I'm studying to a big framework of significance. And I do have a tendency, maybe this is why I've been gravitated to the, what academics call the history of ideas, intellectual history.
Yes.
I do have a tendency to always want to get down to the presuppositions. And I always see every kind of historical problem as somehow having to do with contesting visions of human nature and this sort of thing. And sometimes I think that means I maybe miss the obvious right in front of me, and I get sort of turned around in my historical analysis. Also, perhaps you're picking up on, well, what I think is kind of a necessary quality for any halfway competent teacher and writer, which is just enthusiasm for the thing,
Right.
I mean,
right.
this is why I spent all this time reading books and, dusty old archival documents and my favorite thing, I do some freelance journalism in addition to my work as a historian. And my favorite thing in the world is to, be able to call up some fascinating person and say, I'm writing this article, and will you talk to me for an hour about your fascinating life? And it's just great. And so, I guess I've had the same reaction to my conversion to Christianity. There's this silly misconception that Christianity is intellectually stultifying, that to become a Orthodox traditional Christian is to shut off all kinds of questions and accept a black and white way of thinking. And that has not been my experience. My experience has been, and I didn't expect this. I didn't think it would be an anti-intellectual experience, but I've been really taken off guard by the intellectual excitement that I've felt, by this sort of new prompting to investigate more deeply all these dimensions of the faith that, of course, I had some, significant familiarity with just because of my profession. But to go so deeply into biblical studies, some of these theological questions, the question of miracles. Right? My major research project right after I finished researching the resurrection was the question of contemporary claims of miraculous healing, something I'd never looked into before. It's been so exciting for me. And this has brought me some measure of relief because I got evangelized in the context of a Southern Baptist megachurch, and it's a church that, even by the standards of the Southern Baptist Convention, puts a great deal of emphasis on evangelism and missions. It, sends out the most missionaries of any church in the denomination, and has done so for more than 10 years. And I was daunted by this, thinking, I'm not, my faith is still pretty fragile. I have to talk myself into this crazy stuff every morning. Like, how am I going to be an evangelist? And then it dawned on me that evangelism is just telling people what happened to you. That's actually evangelism. And that was a huge relief.
Yes, exactly so. Yeah. Well, Molly, thank you for telling us what other people experienced over the course of American history through all these various charismatic figures and movements that have come along. But thank you also for your own personal story, and for the fact that it adds its own evidence to, I think, a long arc of God's surprising activity in America, and obviously in many, many other places as well. I think that I'm not alone in saying that we live in a period where charisma seems to be doing as much damage as it is helping. And that's often been the case historically, as you point out. And at the same time, it also witnesses to the activity of God, who continues to pursue us as human beings and as people who happen to live in America in a particular set of ways or experiences that you've witnessed to through this book, and which your own story is now, in some sense, at least, a part of. It's been a great joy and honor to have this conversation. Thank you very, very much.
That's great. This has been so fun. Thank you for having me.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Laberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Laberton. Thanks for listening with me.